For decades, Congress had slashed the budget of the IRS, but you may remember back in 2022 when Congress gave the IRS $80 billion over the next 10 years. And the question is, what's the IRS been doing with that money since? So joining me to talk all about it is the Deputy Treasury Secretary, Wally Adeyemo. Hi, Wally.
Hi, Lisa. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. Okay, so my question is, what have you been doing with that money? I know the president has talked a lot about having big corporations and the wealthy pay their fair share, but has the IRS really been doing that?
It's exactly what we've been doing at the IRS. And you mentioned it. Congress hasn't given the IRS this type of money in a long time, but it's been decades. The last time the IRS had money to improve their digital infrastructure was the 1960s. That was before we had ATM machines, before we had a personal computer, before we sent a man to the moon. Saying the IRS computers is old is an understatement. So we've been using that money to improve our digital system so we can do things like use machine learning to find out ways in which, frankly, mostly wealthy Americans have been trying to stay away from paying their taxes. Most Americans pay their taxes on time, but today we have a $600 billion gap between the amount of taxes we're owed and the amount we collect. We just announced a few weeks ago that due to the money from the Inflation Reduction Act, we discovered a scheme that wealthy people had been using to avoid paying up to what we think is at least $50 billion worth of taxes. So the IRA is already working to bring in more money, but in addition to doing that, we're using the IRA to improve customer service for normal Americans who just want to pay their taxes. For example, creating Direct File, which is a free way for Americans to be able to file their taxes with the IRS. And we've also made it easier to call us on the phone, where now we went from answering 13% of your calls to now being close to 90% of the calls because of the money from that Congress gave the IRS just a few years ago.
All right. So Wally, you just laid out a bunch of things in there. I want to take that piece by piece. So you talked a little bit about going after the wealthy in terms of, I know the IRS has announced more audits, and we're talking about 50%, 3 times and 10 times the amount of audits on the super wealthy who have positive income over $10 million. We talking about corporations with over 250 million in assets and complex partnerships as well. But the IRS said that wasn't going to actually start until 2026. So I'm trying to figure out, because we do have that tax gap. I think the latest number I found was $688 billion. Why so long? Why do we have to wait until 2026 for that to happen?
So it's important to note that waiting for that is because we've got to hire people to do those audits. For those wealthy companies, people who have more than $10 million or companies with more than $250 million, they have armies of lawyers and accountants who are working for them. And because of the money Congress has given us, now we have the money to go and hire people who can look through the thousands of pages they send to the IRS. But we're not waiting till 2026 to conduct audits. For example, I just mentioned that through some of the audits we've already started to do, we've discovered a scheme that should help the IRS bring in an additional $50 billion from wealthy Americans. We've also launched audits against millionaires who for years just had decided not to file their taxes because they didn't think the IRS would be able to catch them. I think the thing that's important to remember is what most of the people who are watching this know. The vast majority of Americans pay their taxes on time. And our goal now is to make sure that the system's fair so those people who aren't paying are required to pay. And now we have the money to do that.
You know, when we talk about audits, Wally, I think people start to get really nervous because they think, audit's such a terrifying word to most like regular taxpayers. And I know the president has said he's not going to raise taxes on people making over $400,000. And certainly the Treasury Secretary has said in congressional hearings that they're also not going to increase the amount of audits for those making under $400,000 a year. But my question is traditionally, that's where people get audited the most, is sort of the lower tax brackets. Why go after those people? What is it about that? Why is that happening as opposed to focusing whatever resources you can on the wealthy and big corporations that, like you're talking about, do a lot of the time skirt the tax system?
And I want to be clear that the secretary not only said that we're not going to increase audits for people under 400,000. She wrote a memo to the IRS commissioner and to myself saying that we shall not do so, and telling us that we shouldn't use our resources to do that. So it's more than just words from the secretary. And the reason that in the past, before we got the money from Congress, the president fought for, that people were auditing people under $400,000 more, was frankly because it was easier. Because they don't have the armies of lawyers. Their tax returns are easier to review. We didn't have the technology it took to be able to go after the wealthiest taxpayers. But now that we have the money to improve our digital ecosystem and also to hire more people, it means we have the resources to go after the people who are the most likely to try and skip out on our taxes, which are wealthy taxpayers. And that's exactly what we're doing now. And we're already showing results. And I just mentioned the $50 billion that we've recently found. And my expectation is that over the course of the next several years, as we invest more here, we're going to be able to make sure that those individuals who for too long haven't been paying their fair share are forced to help contribute to helping us invest in our country.
You know, as we approach an election year, right? We're approaching the election in just a few months. And I am wondering if the Biden administration is not reelected, if there is another administration that has a different position on auditing, let's just say, or going after those wealthy corporations or wealthy individuals, could that happen? Could they just, a new administration just pull the rug out from underneath this whole system that you have now developed?
So I'm, of course, not involved in elections. I'm a public official, so I'm bound by the Hatch Act. But what I can say is that while there have been a lot of people talking about removing funding from the IRS, it's important to remember what that money is for. It's not only for going after wealthy individuals who have skipped their taxes, but it's also around improving services for every American. And I know that every American, no matter what party they're in, they want to be able to pay their taxes as easily as possible. They want to be able to call the IRS and get through. And when I got here 3 years ago, the IRS was answering 13% of the calls that they received. That is lower than F. That's an F minus. And because of the money from the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRS is now answering almost 90% of the calls that they receive on a regular basis. And fundamentally, answering those calls means that Americans who need answers about paying their taxes, but also getting access to business tax credits, are able to do that. And our hope is that that is a bipartisan issue that all Americans care deeply about. And hopefully we'll have the resources to make sure that the IRS has the money to continue to upgrade their systems and bring them out of the 1960s into the 21st century.
I have talked to the IRS multiple times about that antiquated system, so I understand the difficulty that the IRS has been up against for all of these years. I am wondering, we hear a lot of lawmakers say that money was going to be used to hire 87,000 IRS agents to come after you. Is that true?
No, it's not. It's being used to hire people who work at the IRS to do two things. One, to help us focus on going after wealthy people who have not paid their taxes or underpaid their taxes. And two, to dramatically improve customer service for the American people. The reason we went from answering 13% of our calls to nearly 90% is because we hired more people to answer calls, and we improved the technology system so that if you didn't want to call and you wanted to get through using the internet, that was easier as well. It also allowed us to introduce a product called Direct File, which is going to allow more Americans to file their taxes to the IRS for free. Ultimately, the thing that we're doing with those resources is making it easier and less expensive for people to deal with the IRS who want to do the right thing and file their taxes, and going after wealthy people who don't pay their taxes.
I'm going to talk about Direct File, I promise, because I have talked about it on my channel multiple times, and it is a big change that is going to be rolled out nationwide really next tax season. So I do want to talk about that. But before I do, one last question. So the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists found that over the last 5 years, the IRS has criminally referred only 22 sort of large corporations and wealthy for tax crimes for evading paying their taxes, while at the same time, in that same time frame, have actually referred 40 times that amount, 848 referrals for self-employed and small businesses. Why?
I think this comes back to the question of resources. And the truth is that for those big companies and the wealthiest individuals, they have armies of lawyers and accountants who work for them, and they send the IRS thousands upon thousands of pages each year for their tax returns. So it's really hard to audit them, and it's really hard to find out when they're doing things that are either allow them to skip out on their taxes. But now that we have the resources from the Inflation Reduction Act, that $80 billion is going to help us not only hire people, but use things like machine learning and technology to help us conduct better investigations, which should help us reverse those numbers. Fundamentally,
Are those numbers acceptable, though, to you and to the IRS?
so I can't speak to criminal referrals. Frankly, what happens is that once there is a criminal referral, then it comes down to the Justice Department to make the decision about whether they're going to charge someone. What I can speak to is audit rates and what we're doing to go after. And I think what we've made very clear is that the current level of audit rates are not acceptable to us. We want to increase audits against the wealthy and against corporations because we recognize that that's where most of the underpayment of taxes exist here. And my expectation is that as we investigate those things, we'll find more things to potentially refer to the Justice Department.
All right. I want to move off of the audit thing, but I want to talk about direct file because you rolled it out as a pilot program this year in certain states that were able to sort of manage this new technology. You know, states also, for the record, have clunky tax technology as well, generally. So now it was so successful that you have decided to roll it out nationwide next year. So what is that going to actually look like for taxpayers?
The truth is that in addition to rolling out direct file nationwide, we're going to offer it to more Americans in the states where it already exists. As you know, we really were only able to deal with simplified tax situations. If you had a W-2, you could apply. Our goal is to make sure that more people in those states are going to be able to use direct file. And over the next several years, to make sure that all working class and middle class Americans have the ability to use direct file. In terms of working with states, we've offered every one of the 50 states in the country the opportunity to sign up to work with us to build out a direct file system that will allow people in their state to be able to file taxes for free. The other thing it's going to help do is reduce the amount of paper forms that each one of these states get, which will mean that people will get their refunds faster and states will be able to process the information more quickly.
I think a lot of people too, Wally, this year were a little, you know, as with everything that is new, people were a little skittish about this. What is it? What do you mean? The government's coming after me. What do you mean? So as sort of explain to people what direct file is and why the government spent the money to create this new technology as opposed to what has been in the mainstream forever. Things like TurboTax and TaxSlayer, private software that they can do themselves. So what's the difference here?
So great question. And I think one of the things we did when we got the money from Congress to improve our systems was we looked around the world to see what is happening in other countries, what's best in class. And what we found was that in countries like the United Kingdom and Australia and other countries around the world, people were able to file their taxes with their government directly for free. And we decided that we wanted to make sure that America would have that same option. So what we did was we invested in building a product that would mean that for an American who is working hard and playing by the rules, they would have the option of filing their taxes directly with the IRS for free. They still have the option of potentially using a private company, but we wanted to make sure that because we know that cost is something that every American is thinking about, that they could do something where they could reduce the cost of filing taxes. And we built out what I'd call a pilot for the first year to see if it worked and see what people thought. And the more than 100,000 Americans who used this pilot, 90% of them said that the experience they had with this was exceptional. And what we've decided now is to make this product available to Americans in every state, as long as the state wants to work with us. And we're in the process now of working with a number of states to make sure that for tax year 2025, Americans all over this country will have the option of not paying someone or paying a company $150, $200 to do their taxes for them, but rather going to the IRS to directfile.gov and having their taxes done for free.
I know people are thinking about this and probably wondering, well, does this mean eventually the IRS is going to get rid of all my other options to
No.
file my taxes?
No, this is going to be a new option that you'll always have the option.
In addition to what you've always had.
You'll always have the other options, be they private firms that offer this service or going to your accountant. But our goal is to really make sure that we're doing everything we can to make it as easy as possible for the vast majority of Americans who do the right thing and pay their taxes. And Direct File is going to be an option that allows you to do that for free.
All right, Wally. Thank you so much for your time today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.